In March of 2026, Oracle terminated roughly 20,000 employees through a single email sent at 6 a.m. in the morning. Not because they were struggling. They had just posted $3.7 billion in quarterly net income, up 27% year on year. And its backlog of signed future business had grown to $553 billion. By the time its annual filing came out in June, the full year total was 21,000 jobs cut. That's roughly 13% of their entire workforce. Severance costs alone came to $1.84 billion, nearly 5 times what they spent the year before. Oracle also did something none of its major peers did. Meta, Microsoft, and Cloudflare all let laid off staff keep some unvested stock. Oracle, on the other hand, forfeited it immediately, the same day people were let go. This wasn't a company in decline cutting costs to survive. This was one of the most profitable software companies on earth, actively expanding, cutting staff anyway. And Oracle is not remotely alone. Across the tech industry in 2026, layoffs have been running at over 1,000 jobs a day, a pace that has already overtaken the entire post-pandemic correction of 2023. And it's happening almost entirely at companies that are, on paper, thriving. So if this isn't a downturn, what exactly is going on? Where is all the saved payroll money actually going? And if the justification for all of this is artificial intelligence, is that justification actually holding up under its own numbers? Let's take a look at the historical comparison first, because it matters. Tech has been laying off workers before. The dot-com crash gutted companies that had no revenue to begin with. The 2022 to 2023 correction was, by most executives' own admission, a hangover from excessive overhiring during the pandemic. Too many people brought on for a boom that didn't last. Both of those waves shared one thing in common. The companies doing the cutting were, in some real sense, in trouble. Revenue was falling short, or headcount had genuinely outpaced demand. What's happening in 2026 looks completely different on the balance sheet. Meta's layoffs landed right alongside a quarter where their revenue was up roughly a third year over year. Oracle's cuts came days after some of its strongest results in years. This isn't a story about companies that overhired and now need to correct course. It's a story about companies that are doing well, choosing to cut anyway, and being extremely specific about where that freed up money is going next. And that destination is not subtle. The 4 largest tech companies still in this race, Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, and Meta, have committed to roughly $725 billion in capex for 2026 alone, a 77% increase over the year before. Almost all of it earmarked for data centers, custom chips, and the physical infrastructure behind AI. Compare that number to what these companies actually spend on their workforce, and the gap becomes almost absurd. At Meta specifically, the company's AI infrastructure budget for the year, $125 to $145 billion, runs somewhere around 4 to 5 times its entire global payroll. Zuckerberg told employees directly that the May layoffs were a consequence of that infrastructure budget, not a metaphor for some algorithm doing their jobs instead. A literal statement about where the cash was going. In fact, one analysis pointed out that even if Meta fully replaced every laid-off worker's function with AI, and it worked perfectly, the total savings would come to around $27 billion, a fraction of what the company is spending on infrastructure regardless. The layoffs, in other words, aren't really the cost-cutting story here. They're the financing mechanism. The payroll dollars aren't being eliminated because a machine is doing that job now. They're being redirected to buy the machine in the first place. Microsoft has followed a similar pattern. More than 23,000 roles have been eliminated across several rounds since 2025. Company leadership has tied those cuts directly to an $80 billion AI infrastructure commitment. Amazon has cut around 30,000 corporate positions since late 2025, spread quietly across nearly every division rather than one dramatic announcement. And this isn't confined to the four giants. Across the wider industry, independent trackers have logged more than 190 companies, cutting close to 120,000 jobs so far this year. Company after company points to AI as the reason. As we'll get to shortly, that reason doesn't always hold up. So who actually bears the cost of this, and who benefits from it? This is where the story gets uncomfortable, because the money isn't just flowing from payroll into GPUs. A meaningful share of it appears to be flowing somewhere else entirely, back to shareholders. S&P 500 companies are projected to authorize a record $1.2 trillion in stock buybacks in 2026, with Apple alone announcing a $100 billion repurchase program and Nvidia authorizing $60 billion. Analysts at JP Morgan flagged something strange about the timing. Tech sector buyback activity has actually accelerated in 2026 compared to the year before. One analyst there called it puzzling. You'd expect a sector worried about financing an enormous AI spending boom to conserve cash, not spend more of it buying back its own stock. Adobe authorized a $25 billion buyback the same week several of its peers were announcing fresh layoffs. Buybacks reduce the number of shares outstanding. That mechanically increases earnings per share. And that matters because a large share of senior executive pay is directly tied to stock performance. None of this proves intent, and is worth being fair here. Companies will point out that capex, buybacks, and layoffs are decided by different parts of the business for different reasons. But look at the pattern as a whole: cutting staff, funding an infrastructure boom, and spending more on buybacks than usual all at once. It's hard not to notice whose interests are being protected here and whose aren't. Because for the roughly 1,000 people losing a tech job every single day in 2026, the consequences are not abstract. Displaced senior engineers are searching for new roles at the highest rate since the 2022 wave. And in the Bay Area specifically, the median time it takes to land a new position has stretched from around 38 days in the back half of 2025 to about 67 days by early 2026. One widely cited estimate suggests that roughly half of all AI-attributed layoffs eventually get rehired, either offshore or at lower salaries domestically. If that's accurate, a lot of the story isn't really about jobs disappearing. It's about jobs getting quietly repriced. One caveat on that number: it comes from financial media citing aggregated data, not one clean primary study. Treat it as credible, but not fully verified. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question underneath all of this. Is AI actually delivering the efficiency gains being used to justify these cuts? A Gartner study of 350 firms published in May of 2026 found that the companies making the deepest AI-attributed layoffs showed no measurable improvement in their financial returns compared to companies that didn't cut as aggressively. Regulators and analysts have started applying the term AI washing to layoffs too, not just marketing claims. That means blaming workforce cuts on artificial intelligence when the real drivers are far more ordinary margin targets, overhang corrections from years earlier, or simply freeing up cash for a capex decision that was already made. If a company was always going to build the data center and was always going to need the cash, blaming AI for the layoff does a lot of convenient narrative work. We needed the money doesn't sound nearly as forward-thinking. This means AI provides zero value, and it would be unfair to suggest otherwise. Some of this capex will likely pay off. Some of these roles genuinely have been streamlined by real productivity tools. And the infrastructure being built right now will probably still be useful in some form for years to come, regardless of how any individual company's bet turns out. But the honest version of the story is not really about robots taking jobs. It's about capital allocation. A small number of extremely profitable companies chose to prioritize an enormous, debt-financed infrastructure bet over their existing workforce. AI made for a more palatable explanation than simply saying they wanted the cash elsewhere. And in several documented cases, they kept sending money to shareholders at a record pace the whole time. Zoom out far enough, and this becomes part of the same story we've told in earlier videos. It's the same debt-financed concentration risk behind the AI bubble itself, just showing up now on the employment side of the ledger rather than the balance sheet side. And it connects directly to why being middle class now costs more than being rich used to. Every one of these displaced workers is a household that just lost income security in an economy where the cost of simply staying afloat keeps climbing regardless. You should be able to click on either of those videos on your screen now. And if you're wondering whether any of these layoffs get reversed once companies realize what AI actually can and can't do, stick around, because that's a story on its own and we're telling it next. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.